I'm a son of the South, and I'm certainly glad that we're finally having this conversation about the South, because you get over 160, almost 170 electoral votes just out of the former 13 Confederate states. And I'm glad we're having this conversation about African-American voters. Now, I'm on my way planning for June 20th, 2020, the Poor People's Assembly National Moral March on Washington. And I have a little bit different perspective living in the South all my life, working in the South. I've seen a lot of candidates on the Democratic side win primaries and read their primary numbers one way and then lose in the general election. So here's the question, Amy, and questions that I think we have to raise and that we're looking into this morning. First of all, the question is, when you say someone won 61% of the black vote, that's good. That should be celebrated. But what is that a percentage of? It's a percentage of those who voted. The other question is, how many weren't inspired to vote? How many weren't inspired to move? Yes, a lot of the initial vote may be based on personality, familiar, and Obama policies. And that's not a bad thing necessarily. But also we have to ask, in those states last night, those 14 states, there are over 40 million poor and low-wealth voters. Now, poor and low-wealth Americans did not support Donald Trump. What was the numbers of poor and low-wealth Americans in those states that turned out or didn't turn out? What didn't inspire them? Some places like Texas, you had 600,000, almost an even split between Sanders and Biden. That means that there is this split in the party and the soul for aspirations. How will the party deal with that? Because that is not some clear, far victory that dismisses, say, for instance, Sanders' policies as senseless, as silly as I've heard some Democrats say, and they have to be very careful with that. The last thing is not only who didn't vote, but in those southern states, we're talking about this black wall, but are the Dems really going to fight after the primaries? Are they going to really invest in the North Carolinas, the Georgias, the Mississippi, the Alabama, Virginia, after the primaries in the general elections? Because, in the general election, oftentimes we see something very different. For instance, last time in the Clinton campaign, they left 500,000 African-American voters off the table. There was really no real effort to go after. And in all of those states, the number of poor and low-wealth people and the number of African Americans who didn't vote held the political calculus to not elect Donald Trump. They could have fundamentally changed. And I want to know, are we really seriously now going to focus on the South and focus on bringing together poor blacks and poor whites in the South? Now, if that happens, we can have a fundamental shift in political calculus in this country. When you address systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism, you can, in fact, bring black and poor and low-wealth white and black people and Latinos together, and you can make significant change. We have a study coming out now that shows if you just organize 2 to 10% of poor and low-wealth black, white, and Latino people in the country, not just in the South, but significantly in the South, you could fundamentally change elections. We have to talk about that, and it's not so much race or class, but it's race and class. I've challenged, for instance, Bernie Sanders and all of the Biden, all of them, as my sister said, to lead with a race analysis, but not about culture, but about real issues, and to deal with the issue of poverty and low wealth. 61% of African Americans live in poverty and low wealth. That's 26 million people. 30-some% of white people live in poverty and low wealth. That's 66 million people. We will never have a political transformation in the calculus in this country until we deal with the issue of poverty. 140 million people, 43% of this nation. Now, the issue of how we're treating African Americans. There's all this talk about the African Americans are the heart of the party. They're the firewall. They're different things. Well, where was all the fervor to ensure that African Americans stayed on the stage? That's an interesting issue. And if we are the heart, and if 61% of African Americans are poor and low wealth, why are most candidates only talking about, if they talk about poverty, they do in the Democrats, they use a pseudonym. Republicans racialize poverty. Democrats run from poverty. We talk about the working class, but not poverty. We looked at the issue of poverty in these states, and we said the number of people who are poor and low wealth in the Super Tuesday states, in the former Confederate states, far outweigh any margin of victory in Senate races or in presidential race. Why are we scared to say the issue? We will never move people until they hear themselves. So here's what I want to put out. If this is a serious conversation about African American people, then why not every candidate put in writing how will their candidate in the future, not what they've done in the past, in the future, deal with the wealth gap? How will it close the wealth gap? How will it deal with the health care gap? How will they deal with racist voter suppression and gerrymandering and expanding access to the ballot? How will they deal with the disparate ecological issues in our communities? How will they deal with militarization in our communities? How will they deal with mass incarceration, resegregation of public schools? How will they increase the number of African Americans in the federal court appointees and increase the number of African Americans in the Senate? And what is the strategy to go after the Senate that is truly holding up progress for poor and low wealth people of every race, creed, and color? Put it in writing and then change the next debate to be about nothing but the issue of systemic racism and poverty, and not just how racism affects black people, but how it undermines the democracy. For instance, every state that is a racist voter suppression state is also a state where once the people who use racist voter suppression get elected, they then block policies of living wages, block policies of health care, and end up hurting more white people in terms of raw numbers than black people. So let's have a full, thoroughgoing debate on these issues. Every candidate needs to say, now, if my policies, this is how it's going to impact the black community. This is how it's going to impact the rural community. This is how it's going to impact the Latino community. Let's move deep, deep, deep into policy and put that out there.